All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Wednesday, October 5th, 2022. I got a fun one for you today. So, right off the bat, we're going to be talking about Bill Burr, who got a little bit of a reaction out of left Twitter yesterday, and one could say it was a positive reaction. He had some surprising comments, sort of defending socialism and going after capitalism. I'll play them for you. And then also, I have a debate between Piers Morgan and Andrew Tate. That's interesting. I got a couple Elon Musk stories, including him getting dogpiled for a proposal on Russia and Ukraine. And now, apparently, the Twitter deal, it's confirmed that it is going through. Elon Musk will be buying Twitter. So there's a lot to say about that. Classic Kim Kardashian committing massive financial crimes. Fun. Lots to say about that as well. And later on, Trump's past caught up with him a little bit. Turns out all of his hobnobbing with Jeffrey Epstein is now currently scaring the shit out of him because he fears that he's about to get called the fuck out. So I got all that and much, much more. Let's go ahead and kick it off here. So Bill Burr is, of course, a very famous, well-known comedian. And he's buddies with Joe Rogan, been on that podcast a bunch of times. I feel like a lot of his stand-up in particular goes viral a lot, and there's a lot of react videos to his stand-up. Well, he got a question from one of his fans, and apparently he answers these during his podcast. And he goes off on a rant here where he basically defends socialism and attacks capitalism, and does it in a very interesting way. So let's listen, and then I'll break it down as we go here.
Socialism. Hi, Bill, you redheaded fuck. I really appreciate the bluntness of that. How are you? Last week you mentioned you don't know why people demonize socialism. I was really taken aback at that statement. Oh, Jesus Christ. Every country that has tried socialism has failed, and it's responsible for tens of millions of deaths. All right, so would you say capitalism is working? It is.
Okay, right off the bat, great point. Because whenever we do these deaths attributable to socialism thing, nobody tells you their criteria, nobody tells you their standard, and they just put everything in the bucket of, this is a death because of socialism. But whenever you talk about capitalism, there is no analysis of, well, how many deaths are due to capitalism? Do we file under that people who are homeless and they die because they're in the streets? Does that count as a death from capitalism in the United States? What about a death explicitly because of our for-profit healthcare system, where, by the way, 45,000 people die every single year because they don't have access to basic healthcare? Does that count as a death from capitalism? Does it count as a death from capitalism, all those dead Iraqis, minimum 200,000 of them, because George W. Bush and Dick Cheney invaded that country, at least in part, for oil? Does it count as a death from capitalism when, you know what the term banana republic comes from? The United States overthrew a government in South America because we wanted to jack their bananas for a banana company. Do all the deaths in that war count as a death from capitalism? So, the issue is, the same people who would make that claim, millions of people died because of socialism, they wouldn't have an objective analysis with a similar standard and criteria for capitalism. In fact, usually the people who make that argument don't say anything about any deaths from capitalism. So, and the other thing is, if you're going to give socialism shit for the deaths of X number of people, right? Well, then, shouldn't you also say, well, here are the examples of successful socialism being implemented? The social democracies, the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, they are a hybrid of socialism and capitalism. And they have way more industries that are nationalized, that are socialized. And they self-report being some of the happiest countries on the planet. So if you're going to say there are hundreds of millions of deaths or whatever are from socialism, are you going to say socialism also helped create some of the happiest countries in the world? So there is no there is no objective criteria, and oftentimes what I hear when I hear the deaths from socialism thing, it's just honestly some NPC who heard some talking point from Steven Crowder or read it in some shitty biased Texas, school book, and they think that what they're saying here is like spitting facts, and it's just not. And Bill Burr's about to get into more as to why that is.
That statement, oh, Jesus Christ. Every country that has tried socialism has failed, and it's responsible for tens of millions of deaths. All right, so would you say capitalism is working? It is not, when like, what is it, like 99% of the wealth is in like fucking 2% of the people's hands? All of these tent cities, you're telling me this is working? You don't think capitalism is responsible for tens of millions of deaths? Anyway, Russia, Germany, China, Cuba, and most recently Venezuela have tried, or right now are socialist countries. As far as I know, whatever Cuba was trying to do, we prevented them from doing with a fucking embargo or whatever the hell we did. We've been fucking with them for 60 years. So I think you're looking at like what a lot of people do is you look at your own country through rose-colored glasses the same way you look at your own sports team like, oh, my team doesn't cheat, but your team does.
He wasn't holding back there, man. He wasn't holding back there. Now, look, I will say this. Here's why I think any discussion of like deaths from socialism and deaths from capitalism and all that, I think it's all garbage. I do. I just think it's like bad science, right? Because there's so many complex social, political, economic factors that might contribute to any individual death, right? Even personal pathologies, etc. So any sort of like, well, this death is because of X. I generally don't even like the conversation. So in other words, even the deaths that I'm saying, oh, these were attributable to capitalism. Like, yes and no, right? And the same thing for some of the, oh, these deaths are attributable to socialism. Yes and no. I just feel like there are too many leaps of logic to have that conversation to begin with anyway. The only thing that I feel confident and comfortable saying in terms of, well, what do we attribute, various deaths to in the political sphere is the connecting tissue between all of the monstrous far-right fascist regimes and like hardcore statist communist regimes is the authoritarianism. That's the connecting tissue of badness, right? So when you talk about Mao or Stalin or Pol Pot or Hitler or Mussolini or all these people, like the connecting tissue of badness is authoritarianism. And same thing goes, like the issue, apart from what he said about Cuba, right? That like we've been fucking with them for a long time, so how can you really tell if they've been a success or not and stuff like that? Outside of that, the issue is the big issue is like, for example, they have very rigid authoritarian controls on their media, and there's no free speech. So if you want to critique Cuba from that perspective, shit, I'm right there with you. But in other words, the operative factor that makes people dislike that government, dislike the Soviet Union, is that it was too authoritarian in nature. And that's why it makes more sense to think of the political spectrum not as just a left to right thing. Because that's how a lot of people think about it. You're either on the left, you're in the center, or you're on the right. And you could be, anywhere along a long spectrum. That's not the best way to conceptualize of a political spectrum. A better way to conceptualize of it, and perhaps this isn't even the best way, but it's a better way, is the quadrant approach, where you have like authoritarian left, authoritarian right, libertarian left, libertarian right. That's a more nuanced, accurate portrayal, and basically the distinction that you're making here is like economic issues versus social issues. Now, sometimes there's overlap, but sometimes there's not, and we have like separate categories for them. So really, the monstrous regimes in history have been authoritarian right or some version of authoritarian left. It's the authoritarianism that's the problem. Now I also have major issues with libertarian right. I think libertarian left is the best approach, of course. Kind of sounds like Bill Burr agrees with me on that. And it is true, you can blame to some extent some issues with Cuba on Western embargo, Western sanctions, holding them back, making them a global pariah. So yes, in part you could do that. Same with Venezuela. endless sanctions we've put on them, a coup we literally tried to do under Trump with Juan Guaido just pretending he's president even though he's not. Some of the things you could blame on the West, but, you know, where I might differ with other lefties is that it's not all that, right? But, again, to the extent that there are issues that I would have a problem with, it stems from the authoritarianism, not the leftism part, not like the economics part. It's more from the authoritarianism. Too much state control in your private life, in your personal life, maybe some heavy-handed stuff economically that is really inefficient, that, you know, makes no sense. So, but look, I love his comments here, because it is true. I feel like whenever people make the argument that he's responding to here, it's just so brain dead. What about deaths from socialism? If we're going to have a conversation about deaths from socialism, then you should also have a conversation about deaths from fascism. You should also have a conversation about deaths from capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, etc. And usually what you find is capitalism gets credit for all of the nominally positive things that happen under capitalism, right? None of the negative things. And socialism gets shit for all of the nominally negative things that happen under it, and gets zero credit for any of the good things, you know? Like, here's one thing I've noticed. When you bring up the successful socialist experiments to people like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, various right-wingers, what they do, they don't try to deny that these countries, the Scandinavian countries, are successful. They don't try to deny that. But what they do is they credit capitalism. They say, oh yeah, well, all the good things that happen are because they still have some capitalism over there. But hold on. How are they doing better than us? And they are way more socialist than us. That doesn't make sense, right? If they're doing way better than us, and they are more socialist than we are, then obviously the socialism has something to do with being better, right? So they don't even try to deny it. But then they, you know what the next point is that they make? I'd say it in your head. I know you know it. They're like really homogenous countries. Which is, what's the argument fundamentally? There's like no black people and no brown people there, so that's why everything's good. I mean, it really is like a mask off kind of comment, right? It's like, well, we think things can only work, obviously, if it's like all white people. Oh my god. Oh man, imagine believing that? Holy fucking shit. Anyway, so, he's right. I mean, he makes a good point, and, I give him extra credit too, because he's one of the only people that I can think of in the comedy world, I mean, you could count him on like one hand, who is not afraid to really go into a taboo area and make a taboo but correct point, you know, because there is sort of a default leaning in the comedy world these days of like center-right, and a lot of people in his social circle wouldn't agree with that, but Bill Burr doesn't give a fuck. He says exactly what he thinks. Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.